conforming to Article 1082. We will continue our study of migration challenges and opportunities for Canada in the 21st century, particularly today focusing again on the global compacts that are under discussion. With apologies to the witnesses, just before you begin, I'm going to take a few minutes with the committee to remind them of a few issues that are in the orders, standing orders of the House that I just wanted to redraw your attention to following our meeting on Tuesday. And I'll be quoting some lengthy portions of the rules for the committee's consideration. And I'm quoting, "The chair is a key figure on any committee, and chairs are so important that when a committee does not have one, it is not considered properly constituted. It can take no work or other activities and cannot exercise any of its powers. Committee chairs have procedural, administrative, and representative responsibilities. Chairs preside over committee meetings and oversee committee work. They recognize the members, the witnesses, and other people who wish to speak at these meetings. As in the House, all remarks are to be addressed to the chair. They ensure that any rules established by the committee, including those on the apportionment of speaking time, are respected. They are responsible for maintaining order and decorum in committee meetings, committee proceedings, and rule on any procedural matters that arises subject to an appeal to the committee." With respect to disorder and misconduct, disorder and misconduct in a committee may arise as a result of the failure to abide by the rules and practices of a committee or to respect the authority of the chair. Disorder and misconduct also include the use of unparliamentary language, failure to yield the floor, or persistent interruption of the proceedings in any manner. However, neither committees nor the chairs have the authority to censure an act of disorder or misconduct. If a committee desires that specific sanctions be taken against those disrupting the proceedings, it must report the situation to the House. The House may then take such measures as it deems appropriate. In the event of disorder, the chair may suspend the meeting until order can be restored, or if the situation is considered to be so serious as to prevent the committee from continuing with its work, the meeting may be adjourned, and that's at the chair's discretion. In addition, the chair may, at his or her discretion, interrupt a member whose observations and questions are repetitive or are unrelated to the matter before the committee. If a member in question persists in making repetitive or off-topic comments, the chair can give the floor to another member. If the member refuses to yield the floor and continues talking, the chair may suspend or adjourn the meeting. With respect to repetition and relevance in debate, the rules of relevance and repetition are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. The requirement that speeches remain relevant to the question before the House, and this is the committee as well, flows from the latter's right to reach decisions without undue obstruction and to exclude from debate any discussion not conducive to that end. The rule against repetition helps to ensure the expeditious conduct of debate by prohibiting the repetition of arguments already made. To neglect either rule would seriously impair the ability of the House to manage its time sufficiently. Notwithstanding their importance, these rules remain difficult to define and enforce and are subjective to the members and particularly to the chair at any given time. I wanted to remind the committee of that. If during these proceedings of our committee I sense that decorum is failing, I am going to take the opportunity to read the statement again, and the clock will remain running while the member's time is on, and you can either use your time to question the witnesses or to listen to me and my discussion about decorum. That will be your choice. Thank you. Now, we're going to begin with our witnesses. Mr. Buz, from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, welcome. We're going to begin with testimony from you, and then Mr. Damian Smith afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and honorable member. Very pleased to be here today for an important topic for my organization, the UN Refugee Agency, which is the Global Compact on Refugees. I had the pleasure to be here not so long ago where I gave an overview of the situation of refugees globally, and the compact really tries to change the way we do business when we do respond to those mass influx of refugees, mainly in Africa, in the Middle East, Asia, and perhaps now in Latin America. Let me remind everyone that 60% of the refugees are hosted in just 10 countries. Turkey, Pakistan, and Uganda are on the front line with 6 million, altogether 6 million refugees. The compact is really to see how we can use the good practices, the lessons learned of more than 60 years of humanitarian and protection response to help those countries shoulder the weight of receiving, hosting, protecting, assisting those refugees. We shared with the committee a brief last week that I'm sure is in front of everyone. So I will not go back to the explanation of what is the compact, how the compact is going to change the way we do our responses with our partners, but rather address directly issues that have been raised during the debate on those issues by this committee over the last 3 or 4 sessions. Canada's obligation with respect to refugees derive from the 1951 Convention, most of which is anywhere international customary law. So whether Canada was party or not to the Convention, all member states of the United Nations are bound by certain rules, certain obligation in terms of protecting refugees, in particular the obligation not to return someone to a country where he or she may be at risk of torture or at risk of for his or her life. Obligation of Canada derive also from the UN Charter, which calls upon member states to cooperate with one another in solving issues which affect peace and security, development, but also humanitarian response. It's in this respect that we have to put the context of the Global Compact on Migration when it calls to responsibility sharing with those frontline countries that I have mentioned, that those frontline countries will rather qualify as burden sharing because they feel the weight of receiving and having to deliver services for all those refugees. So obligation exists for Canada like any other member state under international instruments such as the 51 Convention or the UN Charter. With respect to the issue of internally displaced persons, IDPs, those persons are governed by human rights instruments and in international humanitarian law when they are in a conflict situation. And you know that this year we are celebrating the 20 years of the guiding principle on international displacement, which combine all the rules and rights and obligation of state vis-à-vis those persons who are displaced within their own country. Those are not included in the Global Compact on Refugees because there was a decision by member state at this time of the discussion to focus on the situation of refugees. In terms of obligation of Canada or any other of the 35 countries which have resettlement program, in terms of the commitment to resettlement and offering durable solution, this remains a sovereign decision of any of those 35 countries, including Canada. However, the criteria by which UNHCR, in particular with the support of NGOs and UN partners, identify the most vulnerable for resettlement have been agreed upon by those 35 countries, including Canada, and those are the global resettlement criteria. It's not because we are calling upon other actors, such as the World Bank, the regional development banks, to come to the fore, as well as the private sector, faith-based organizations, cities, to the fore of the response, that we will not need significant funding for our operation. But again, that's a sovereign decision of Canada and other countries to decide the level of funding that they will dedicate to our response globally. Let me just mention that 87% of our budget is drawn from voluntary contribution from state, and 60% of our budget comes from 3 countries: the United States of America, Germany, and not a country, but the European Union. Finally, I wanted to clarify before the committee the situation vis-à-vis the US and their position vis-à-vis the Global Compact on Refugees. At the third committee a few weeks ago, the US delegation expressed full support for most of what is included in the Compact on Refugees. It reaffirmed the commitment of the United States on the objective of the Compact. And it actually asked other countries, I would imagine including Canada, to help in supporting financially and through durable solutions those frontline countries that are addressed in the Global Compact on Refugees, and to increase the space for resettlement, because as you know, the US is the #1 in terms of resettlement space, as well as financial contribution to the response on refugee crises. It's also expressed strong support to UNHCR, but had some reservation, for example, on the issue of detention of asylum seeker, which is not anymore an issue in Canada since Minister Goodale has enacted the alternative to detention as part of the immigration-related processes. So the participation of Canada to hold those discussions has been really at the forefront through representation in Geneva, but also very much through consultation from the NGOs. And I know that you received in front of this committee a number of NGOs who were able to testify to them having been fully consulted on the way that collectively we can see how to do better in helping those frontline countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and these days in Central America, to shoulder to help them address the protection needs and the services that those refugees requires. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Hi. So my name is Greg Damian Smith. I'm the Associate Director of the Global Migration Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at University of Toronto. I just want to thank you and say it's a privilege to be able to be part of this discussion. And I want to open by stating that the conversation comes at a pivotal moment for what we call global migration governance. It's a time when the international humanitarian system and multilateral institutions and the rules-based international order are increasingly under strain and even under threat by some member states. And the Global Compact on Refugees can help reinvigorate the norms, laws, and institutions that comprise the international refugee regime. And Canada can play a strong leadership role, but unfortunately at the moment it seems that our role is mostly rhetorical, and it's time to stop resting on our laurels. And concretely, this means a serious and sustained effort to increase our official development assistance and dismantle some of the silos between and within federal governments in order to deliver it effectively. And I'll return to that point in a moment. So the committee's heard from leading experts and practitioners, and I'm assuming that you know the state of affairs. You know that the New York Declaration of 2016 was endorsed by all UN member states, that Canada played a leading role in developing both of the compacts, and that they reflect the balance of interest between host and donor states. And now it's time to do the actual work. So I want to reiterate a few basic facts about why we need the Global Compact on Refugees and what Canada can do. First, the international humanitarian system is failing. The current financial and political commitments cannot meet the needs of displaced people or the states that host them. And second, the burden for dealing with displaced people is disproportionately falls on poorer, more fragile states. And to date, the international community is focused on what we call a care and maintenance approach for dealing with displaced people. That entails short-term humanitarian funding to try to meet people's basic needs while they look for a durable solution to their displacement. And you know that the international community recognizes 3 durable solutions to people's refugee status. That's return to countries of origin, naturalization in their host states, or third country resettlement internationally. But the refugee regime wasn't designed for the current displacement dynamics. Most people can't return home, and only a tiny fraction is resettled internationally every year. And the effect of that is increasingly protracted refugee situations. So protracted refugee populations and protracted humanitarian aid can distort host state labor and housing markets. It can strain resources, upset political and ethnic balances, and foster animosity with host communities. And host states are understandably reluctant to use international development assistance for refugees. Weak solidarity from donor states means that they have little incentive to naturalize or integrate refugees. So these protracted refugee situations and funding shortfalls have given rise to a growing phenomenon of what we call irregular secondary movement. So that's when, rather than stagnating in host countries and waiting for a chance at international resettlement that's very likely not going to come, refugees decide to pay human smugglers to try to make it to a safe country where they and their families might have some kind of future. And the fact that migrants and refugees share the same irregular migration systems, so they comprise what we call complex mixed flows, is one of the sources of anti-refugee sentiment in liberal democracies, where everyone claiming asylum is immediately suspect of being mere economic migrants or queue jumpers. And it seems not to matter the fact that no queue actually exists, that the migrant-refugees distinctions often blurry at best, that global north states see an infinitesimal proportion of refugees globally, and that we have the resources to properly scale our asylum systems. Because unfortunately, scapegoating refugees and whipping up fear about public safety is a well-worn tactic for electoral gain. At the same time, the states that built the refugee regime are abandoning the pretense of rights and due process by offshoring migration controls to authoritarian states, militarizing borders, and cutting social assistance to make their countries less favorable destinations. Effective international burden sharing can help forestall this race to the bottom. And not coincidentally, that's the basic premise of the Global Compact for Refugees. So the main mechanism for this burden sharing, the one I want to talk about, is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, or the CRRF. So the CRRF calls for new and additional international contributions at the nexus of humanitarian and development aid, or what they called at the World Humanitarian Summit, the new way of working. Excuse me. The main goal of linking humanitarian development programming through the CRRF is to foster the inclusion and self-reliance of displaced people and concurrently relieve the burden on host states. It's as much a forward-looking way of dealing with displaced people as it is a political recognition that most of them are not going to go home or be resettled.
I could just to slow down one notch for the interpreter. I'll give you
sure.
a little extra time.
Sure, thank you.
But not yours.
I'm used to just talking as much as I want and forcing students to listen. So while Canada helped draft the Global Compact on the Global Compact for Refugees, our support for the CRRF seems remarkably less clear. And the fact is that if you look at where our programming is right now, we're simply rebranding existing development and humanitarian programming and calling it a root causes approach to irregular migration and refugee situations. It's just old money with new labels. And I had the chance to conduct a study this year on the CRRF for Global Affairs Canada, specifically looking at it in the Central American context, where it's a regional mechanism called MIRPS. And that study found three main impediments to real solidarity and burden sharing for the CRRF from Canada. The first is that the timelines for humanitarian and development programming and the funding cycles are very different. Second, despite the amalgamation of CETA and DFATE, programming at GAC remains functionally siloed between humanitarian and development work. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, we're not spending enough money. Canada's ODA is quite paltry, to be honest. The recent budget called for a 0.26% of gross national income over the next years. So against inflation, that's actually a real decline. And it's also decreased from the 0.31% since the last 2012 OECD review. So this current government is spending less money on ODA than the previous government. And I've had several conversations with people at Global Affairs and IRCC about this situation. The situation is basically that the old CETA people and the humanitarian people don't work together on programming. Regional offices within GAC don't communicate thematically. And Global Affairs and IRCC work in parallel on the same issues when they should be complementary, and that's also the issue with the CRRF. And the public service is waiting for a champion with the political capital to provide direction on work at the humanitarian development nexus to support the CRRF. And of course, the situation's complicated. Bureaucratic path dependency and financing constraints are real, but it's far from impossible. Canada's civil service, academic institutions, and civil society organizations have a wealth of expertise in all of these areas. And together we can readily identify pilot projects with clear outcome metrics for displaced people in CRRF countries, leverage international development financing, mobilize existing resources to incentivize host state cooperation, and offer complementary pathways for resettlement and labor migration to relieve the most pressing burdens on host states. And just to close, in my opinion, the discussion about whether or not we should sign on to the compacts or how they affect our sovereignty missed the point entirely. It's not whether we should do this stuff, but how we equitably share the burden moving forward.
Thank you very much. Begin with Ms. Zahid.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to both the witnesses, and thanks, Mr. Abuse, for coming back again. My first question for you is, and I want to spend some time with you to address some of the charges and fears about the compacts we hear leveled by its opponents. So my brief, first question would be, these compacts are non-binding. Am I correct?
Correct. But it's a political commitment, and therefore we expect all the member states to deliver a result against the commitments which have been agreed upon between the host countries and the countries like Canada, which are more in the funding seat.
So go from there. The concerns which have been raised, and I would like to quote one of them, the United Nations could ask Canada to change its policy because of the Global Compact on refugees. So let me ask, does the UN not already lobby Canada on its refugee policy in the absence of any non-binding compacts?
The UN is only the collection of 193 member states, including one of them being Canada. So we are here at the service of the 193 member states. But obviously, we do advocate for the policies to be aligned to the international agreement, whether they are legally binding or political commitment.
So that means that signing these compacts will not change the situation in that case.
Let me repeat, there is no signing of the compact. It's going to be as part of the omnibus resolution of the High Commissioners for Refugees resolution to the General Assembly, which will affirm that the member state, 193 member states, are affirming the value added of the compact as a vision, a tool, a roadmap to help those countries in the front line of the refugee response and to share better the responsibility, financially and otherwise.
So will the non-binding compact change at all the UN's ability to lobby Canada on the refugee policy and also Canada's ability to make its sovereign policy decisions?
Every member state remains a sovereign decision maker insofar as those matters are concerned, but there is an expectation of cooperation between member states.
Does the UN or the UNHCR have any plans to assign rapporteurs to quote, disparage Canada or question its sovereign policies if we were not in line with the compact?
No, there's a mechanism in the Global Compact which is called the Global Forum, which is every 4 years, which will be held at ministerial level, where all countries will come together to renew their political commitment, to renew their commitment in terms of funding, in terms of resettlement level, in terms of helping getting more actors, whether it's the private sector, those development institution, international financial institution, but it's going to be a peer mechanisms between member states.
Thanks for clarifying that. I think we all agree that migration, whether it is forced or driven by economic necessity, is something we should reduce and we want to reduce. And I think we can all agree that irregular, unplanned migration across national borders is not desirable. So with these assumptions, does it make sense to you that some would choose to abandon working multilaterally with the global community to address irregular migration and its root causes in a coordinated way, and instead try to do it alone and all yourself from the world? And German Chancellor Angela Merkel, addressing the parliament last week, called it nationalism in its purest form.
Professor Smith has already alluded to this response, and I'm happy to offer him the floor.
Thank you. It's a fact that when states make unilateral decisions about irregular migration, how they're going to react to irregular migration, it necessarily affects other states. It necessarily affects their neighbors, and there's cascading effects through irregular migration systems. The best and the only real way to deal with this proactively in a way that conforms to the way that what states have agreed to for protecting the rights of all people as their human rights and rights as refugees and migrants is a system of collective action to address root causes of irregular migration. Unilateral policies have very pernicious effects on neighbors and migrants alike.
My next question would be for Mr. Buse also. What sort of input has Canada given the UNHCR regarding the kinds of cases it would like to see referred regarding the vulnerable populations?
So we are in a close dialogue with IRCC, the Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, which is our partners in the resettlement, especially when it comes to government-assisted or the blended visa program, refugees who are resettled to Canada. As I briefly mentioned, the global criteria of resettlement have been agreed upon by 35 member states, including Canada, and they are an objective assessment of who are the most vulnerable refugees, which survival is at risk in the first country where they found asylum. Let me clarify that Canada decides the level of resettlement. Every year, the IRCC minister comes before Parliament to submit the immigration level, and as part of the immigration level, there's those who will be admitted to the country on humanitarian grounds. And then there's a discussion between IRCC and UNHCR on where those refugees should be coming from in terms of us providing IRCC with a mapping of where are the most vulnerable refugees. And as we speak now, we have identified 1.4 million out of the 25 million refugees, 1.4 million who are in need of resettlement as a survival, not for a better life, but really as a survival. And Canada will resettle through the government and UNHCR 10,000 this year.
I have time, Chair?
You are done. Thank you. Mr. Tilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just continuing on the lines of the questioning of Ms. Zahid on the issue of non-binding, the agreement, the compacts being non-binding, I'd like to make a comparison and see if you agree whether or not there is a comparison to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And my view of that is there was an agreement on the climate change, how to deal with climate change, and terms were set out, proposals for each member state to agree to do certain things. Now, I expect, and that agreement's non-binding, I expect if a member state changed their mind, there would be some difficulty by the other member states or by the organization of it. So my question to you is, you have answered Ms. Saeed's questions, that it is non-binding and it's not going to affect the sovereignty, it's not going to affect other things of Canada. But my question is, what if Canada decides not to follow the recommendations that are being made under the compact? What might happen?
As in any international forum, it's a question of good relationship with the other member states who are, who on their side may be abiding by the political commitment which have been reflected in the compact. But let's not confuse things here. The compact doesn't have clear-cut measurable recommendation to which Canada will be able to be assessed in an objective manner. It's a commitment to say to the frontline countries, to say you are receiving 85–90% of the refugees. We are not. You are often in situation where you have difficulties financially to develop your own countries for your own citizens. Those citizens are the ones receiving this extra demographic pressure of refugees. So it's, this agreement reflects just good partnership at the level of international relationship.
I understand
international
that.
relations.
I guess I'm looking that currently the Liberal Party is the government in Canada, but there are three major parties in this country, the New Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party, and one or other of the parties may come to power, may come to office, and may not agree with what the former government was doing, and may challenge what is being under the compact. So my question to you is, what might happen if that took place? Would there be pressure? Would there be aspersions cast on a new government to perhaps follow along the lines of the previous government?
Two things. There will be certainly advocacy on the part of my organization to call for Canada to do more for refugees, whether it's in terms of resettlement level or funding level. But as it was mentioned before, I think we should not lose track that over the years, Canada has been a strong partner. We are asking for more, but has been a strong partner of my organization and of countries which are receiving refugees. Whether you look at, as mentioned by Professor Smith, the funding level by previous government or this government, or if you look at resettlement level based on referral by UNHCR by the previous government or this government. So I'm sorry to make this comment and allow me to, it may be just a bit of a rhetorical question that you're asking, because in the past, over the last 60 years, Canada has always been supportive of other countries when it comes to delivering humanitarian and development.
I understand that, and I expect either all of the three governments will agree with that, but they may not agree with philosophical statements that have come forward. But Mr. Smith, you made some comments, some derogatory comments actually, about Canada, the current government not spending as much money as previous government has spent, and you made some comments generally about the government. And that, I guess I tie that into the issue of the fact that this is a non-binding agreement. So I guess my question is the pressure on a government to change where they're going as to what went before.
Your question is whether or not the government feels pressure or they should feel pressure.
Well, my question is, if we enter into this non-binding agreement, I suggest to you, in fact, it's a binding agreement.
I think that if we leave considerations of political affiliation aside and just look at
Change from time to time.
They do change at time to time, but the one constant in international relations is the sovereign self-interest of states. And if we consider well-regulated and well-managed international mobility in a way that you don't see large-scale irregular migration flows on borders that can do things like potentially undermine the entirety of something like the European project through the EU, or create domestic violent backlashes from white nationalists against asylum seekers, then it's definitely in state self-interest to cooperate, and it's also cheaper to cooperate with other states in the international system.
One of you mentioned that the United States was in support of the compacts. My understanding was that the United States was not in support of the compacts because of the issue of sovereignty, as are Australia, Israel, I believe, Bulgaria, and several others. My question is, in other words, you've contradicted what I've been led to believe about the United States, and I don't know what you meant by that, but the issue of sovereignty, this is to either one of you. I guess the question is, what's the effect of there's a fairly large number of member states that are not going to participate in the compacts. What effect is that? What effect of that is? What's the effect of that on the overall philosophy?
I'm afraid that the member's
compacts?
come to the end of his time. However, I think it's an important question, so I'm going to pretend I don't see the clock, because I think the two compacts may need to be separated on that issue. If you'd like to take some time to explain and answer the question, would be helpful.
So briefly, the United States did not participate in the consultation leading to the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, the one which will be adopted formally in Marrakesh in 10 days. The United States delegation in Geneva and later on in New York has participated to the consultation on the Global Compact on Refugees. When it came to the third committee of the General Assembly, which is a subcommittee just before, similar to your committee, just before the resolution has to be adopted by the General Assembly, the U.S. delegation affirmed its support for most of the content of the Global Compact, reaffirmed its support to the UN refugee agencies, but decided not to join the consensus on the resolution, which was affirming the Global Compact on Refugees, for the reason not of sovereignty, but sorry, I should not interpret the U.S. delegation, but flagging in particular that one of the recommendations of the compact is that asylum seekers should benefit from alternative to detention, which is not in line with, as you know, the current policies of the U.S. administration.
Very briefly.
As a political scientist, the entire purpose of these states pulling out or saying that they won't support the Global Compact on Migration is domestic political gain. And the audience there is the domestic audience. You're talking about Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, Poland. These are the countries which belong to the Visegrad group of states, which is a group of states in Central and Eastern Europe that have a stated objective of undermining multilateral institutions based on anti-Semitic tropes about who controls multilateral institutions.
Doesn't agree with that, though.
Australia is a pioneer of a policy that was first called the White Australia policy, and then became known as the Pacific Solution, which was to excise their territory from the Refugee Convention so that they could indefinitely warehouse refugees on small islands. Detain.
I think I need to end you there. I know you could go on, but we'll read your paper.
Ourselves with,
Don't forget
in my
Bulgaria. Ms. Quad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm wondering, Professor Smith, what your opinion is in this situation. does firing tear gas across a border into a sovereign territory of another country to prevent would-be asylum seekers or claimants from reaching a border constitute respecting human rights? And is that consistent with the goals and principles of the compact?
The practice of shooting tear gas across borders and pushing people back from claiming asylum is unfortunately part of a growing trend in border control that some states, Israel and Hungary, for instance, call hot returns, which is to push people back over borders, regardless of whether or not there's a safe third country agreement with the previous transit state. And some people call pushback policies. I mean, the basic answer is no, it's not in line with any norm that we would consider.
And totally right in terms of norm, but the compact does not address those situations. The compact addresses the situation of the frontline countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Asia, down south in Central America, who do not have necessarily the financial means, the services, the refugee status determination procedures in place to support on their own the response to mass arrival of refugees that we have seen, like the Rohingya, the South Sudanese, or the Syrians. So the compact does not address situation that you are referring to.
Right. I understand that because of geography, because of the principle behind the compact, from what I understand. And so I just want to be clear, because in those circumstances, I guess irrespective of the geography, if you were to apply the principle of compact throughout the globe, no matter where the asylum seekers might be, that those kinds of practices would not be consistent with the compact. That's what I'm trying to get an understanding of, and that's the answer I believe.
And with the 51 Convention, which is, as I mentioned earlier, not only a legally binding instrument on state party to the Convention, but which contains customary international law by which asylum seekers should be entitled to the protection of the state where they claim asylum. Correct.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was trying to get that answer to see whether or not a country that engages in that kind of practice, are they acting consistently with the 1951 Convention? And thank you for that answer, because I couldn't quite actually get that answer from our own officials with IRCC. So thank you for that. Now, so given that this is the environment, and this, Professor Smith, as you mentioned, in your comments, irregular migrants impacts other states, right? Because clearly there is an implication. But because the compact is geographically located and targets a different set of community members, so in the situation where in the United States, which is not part of the compact, where we have asylum seekers trying to get to safety and unable to do so because tear gas is being thrown at them, and the U.S. has made a declaration that those who are fleeing domestic violence or gang violence would not be able to make an asylum claim, and the latest with the LGBTQ community in terms of identity. How would you suggest the international community deal with that? And will there be a provision or an attempt through the international community to address this situation, whether it's the compact or otherwise?
I still think that there's some that we're moving between the GCR and the GCM, the two compacts, a bit in the way that we're discussing this. If Canada wants to do something about the situation on the border with Mexico and the U.S., the provisions in the compact that allow them to do that are to address the displacement situation in Central America through the regional MIRPS process. I can send you the report that I wrote for Global Affairs Canada about this. I mean, the level of violence and ecological degradation and other push factors in the Northern Triangle of Central America countries are quite profound and require sustained and massively increased international assistance if we want to forestall the types of irregular migration crises that give rise to this type of behavior on the border.
I would appreciate that, actually, if you can send that to the committee. I think every member in this committee could benefit from it, so I would appreciate it if you could send it. And I wonder if there's anything else to add from you, Mr. Brice.
As you know, the state of affairs in the international relation means that there's no international police. There is the Security Council, which is the ultimate decision-making body who can decide when there is an infringement on peace and security under Chapter 7 by one of the member states. Otherwise, it's just good relationship between neighbors, as it was well explained by Professor Smith, and therefore it's the responsibility of each member of the international community to try to hold each other accountable and support when one country does not seem to be able or willing to abide by the norms of the 51 Convention or any other norm, help them to do so through advocacy, technical support, funding, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. You know, there are those who argue that Canada should not be part of the compact. In fact, I just got a couple of emails from my own constituents saying this is very dangerous, it's really bad for Canada. Please, please, please make sure that we are not part of that. To those who make those comments, what are your thoughts, and what would you say to them? Start with you.
Very briefly.
I'd reiterate what I said, that a world of well-governed and well-managed migration is in every state's interest, and that it meets basic criteria of upholding and protecting vulnerable people's rights.
10 seconds.
To add to that, there's a long tradition of Canada to support the most vulnerable abroad, and Canadians should be proud of that.
That's it. Thanks.
Clarify on the time question, Mr. Chair. My Conservative colleagues was given extra time, as you've noted. Important questions were asked and extra time was given. And so that was on your discretion, although not according to the rules which govern this committee. So I'm just wondering, at what point would there be discretion given to other committee members to have that extension of time?
There often is, and if you would like the total number of minutes you've been given discretionarily since I became chair, I have that number.
Well, thank
If
you
you would
very
like
much.
that, I'm happy to give that to you.
Yes,
and you'd
more
find
specifically in this committee meeting today, though, you know, that was an explicit provision that was given. And I don't disagree with that, Mr. Chair, but simply to say, though, when that is being applied, I think fair enough to say it should apply to all the members.
Thank you. Mr. Tabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I actually want to follow up on what my colleague was saying, that there are those that say that the global impact on migration aims to erase national borders or encourage irregular border crossings. And I think this is dangerous to say. And the reason why I'm saying that is I'll get to it in the remaining of my questions. The objectives of this global compact are for safe, orderly, and regular migration, as the compact outlines. And it outlines it in Objective 23, strengthen international cooperation and global partnership for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And I want to turn your attention to number 5, enhance the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. And as we noted in the testimonies, there are Eastern European countries that have pulled out of that migration. And I think it's dangerous. The reason why I'm mentioning this is if we look at not too far away from us, kind of in our own backyard, we look at Mexico, and there are smugglers there that make up to $2,000 a day smuggling individuals. They make up to $200 smuggling a Mexican migrant, and they make up to $500 for a non-Mexican migrant. If there's an individual working in a factory on Juarez, a border city, they make up to $5 a day. So you can see the discrepancy here. And I think when states pull out of the global impact of migration, you're essentially creating or you're fostering this type of human smuggling that is very dangerous for individuals, because it keeps people, the most vulnerable individuals, it keeps them at the hands of smugglers, and they can be susceptible to sex trafficking, and I'm alluding to women and girls, and this can be very dangerous. So my question is to you, is that Canada has in their foreign policy put a gender lens on their foreign policy to protect the most vulnerable, and that could be women and children. So if you can add to that on why states need to get on board to this global compact and to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected.
It's a very important question, and the dynamics are very important. I've spent several years working in irregular migration systems, as we call them, several years in North Africa and the Middle East and the Balkans, and now increasingly in Central America. The very basic fact of irregular migration, why markets exist for smuggling and trafficking, is that prohibition in the face of market demand creates illicit markets. So people want to move, people need to move. As you mentioned, there's vast economic discrepancies between states, which acts as the kind of push and pull factors generally. And when you force people to undertake irregular journeys with increasingly sophisticated and networked criminalized smuggling rings, very often they overlap with trafficking, and people can become trapped on their journeys, and women and girls can be pushed into situations of trafficking. For domestic labor is also a major trend, but also forced sex work. It's a big issue that's not. It doesn't lend itself well to very simple solutions and policy statements. But the simple fact is the market dynamics that I alluded to.
Rose, if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, no, that's one of the issues which has an overlap in both compacts, the migration and the refugees, the whole issues of trafficking and smuggling, as well as a few other issues. And for the very reason explained by Professor Smith, the concern is that you increase the risk for persons who are already vulnerable because they are fleeing situation of persecution or conflict to fall within the hands of criminal organized organization, which will help them to find safety. I mean, hoping that they will help them find safety, but actually being trapped into trafficking and sexual and other forms of exploitation, including contemporary form of slavery. So as a result, it's important that we create legal pathways for asylum seekers, and as well as for migrants, but yeah, I'm speaking about asylum seekers, for them not to have to resort to those practices.
Thank you. And also we had testimony from our former Foreign Affairs Minister, Lloyd Axworthy, and he recommended to the committee and to the Government of Canada to confiscate frozen assets of crooked foreign leaders and use the money for the benefit of the population that they've swindled. Do you agree with taking certain assets from certain rogue states and putting it into resources where we can help asylum seekers and refugees?
I mean, for UNHCR, we have no position on this. This is something I think the IRCC and GAC colleagues have responded that they are going to explore very closely in terms of the legal and policy framework which will be required to do so. What is important for my organization as well as all the NGOs which are working is that whether or not this work, we need additional funding to deliver the services that are required on the ground to protect and assist refugees.
I would say that Canada should focus on the comprehensive refugee response framework as it's been negotiated painstakingly between host and donor states. Very briefly and somewhat politically on this idea, if you try to get, Canada will run squarely into Europe's interests in migration controls if you try to take money from authoritarian states and get it to pay for asylum seekers. I can point specifically to the Sudanese government that's paid several hundreds of millions of euros per year to control migration through their country.
I need to end you there. Thank you very much. Madame Boucher, vous avez 5 minutes.
Ms. Boucher, 5 minutes if you wish to share. I will. Thank you, Chair. I'm a new member today. I'm in fact replacing someone. I had already heard about the compact, because I'm on international affairs. But I'd like to have an explanation. I had just seen 3 hours ago now that another country is refusing to sign this compact. And this is just another name on a long list of countries who are refusing to sign the compact because it's too binding. What I'm trying to find out then is, why are there so many countries refusing to sign this compact? And why, in this case, should Canada sign it? Because based on what I've read, there are many countries refusing to sign the compact. So I would like to have an explanation as to why they are refusing to sign it, and why Canada, in this case, given such a long list that's getting longer, why it should sign a compact that other countries are refusing to sign.
Donc ici, vous parlez du
You're talking about the Global Compact on Migration and not the one on refugees. For the UNHCR, it's not up to us to respond to this question. Instead, it would be the International Organization on Migration, which you received last week at this committee.
Duncan, yeah. I have no problem.
As I mentioned earlier, that list of countries, it's not a long list of countries. It's 10 countries-ish. But the domestic politics in the countries under question, again, look at Viktor Orban's Hungary, look at Austria right now, look at the government and rule of law in Poland. These are places where xenophobic, right-wing, anti-UN sentiment gets votes. That's the answer. That's the whole answer, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Mr. Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate that frankness, and I was going to ask the same question as my colleague did, Mr. Tabera. And so I don't know if you answered it in the rest of her question or not, but in regards to our presentation from Mr. Axworthy from the World Refugee Council, and I mean, they're formed to try and bring countries together to figure out how we can solve these refugee situations and crises that are developed around the world. Obviously, you can't relocate everybody. We've got to figure out a way to make sure that we can get them back on their own turf and their own ground. The first of the couple of things that you had for timelines, Mr. Bosch, as well. And so confiscating frozen assets, realigning them back into it. Mr. Axworthy was in the had a big article in, I believe it was the Winnipeg Free Press over the weekend, that he had a very clear statement of how to develop that. And I wonder if you can see if that World Refugee Council is a body that could be utilized, or if there is something else. I mean, they're bringing countries together instead of worrying about whether they're signing a compact or not, getting them together, as I believe you said, Mr. Smith, that share the burden. It's not whether or not we sign the compact, it's how do we get them together, and how does everybody work to make sure that we have an efficient means of being able to relocate these people and deal with the country's problems that they have in their home states.
Lloyd Axworthy knows a lot more about the dynamics of diplomacy and international politics than I do, obviously. And with respect to the work of the World Refugee Council, I mean, one of their mandates is to think outside of the box about how to address global displacement crises. Again, we have the 1951 Refugee Convention, we have the 67 protocols, we have the International Refugee Regime, UNHCR, the IOM joined the UN system this year. We have, for the first time in a very long time, the makings of a global governance regime for international mobility, which is something that hasn't existed, despite the fact that human mobility is one of the last kind of one of the last issue areas that doesn't have a global regime. And I think that's where we should focus our attention.
That's 5 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Whalen, we have maybe 2-3 minutes from you.
Okay, we'll have to keep it tight. I would like to focus on what Mr. Smith had mentioned earlier, which is the how. So Canada is currently at 0.26% GNI on the ODA, and if we were even just to get to the average, we'd have to add $1 billion to our assistance. So to get to where we were expected to be, we'd have to add about $7 billion. If we added $1 billion, how far would that go in helping address the refugee crisis? And if you don't have an idea about where $1 billion would go, maybe Mr. Booth.
I'm gonna defer.
Our funding requirements are at $8 billion. As I mentioned, we are going to receive approximately $4 billion. So if you were contributing the $1 billion just said to the UN Refugee Agency, you would have a major impact, as you can imagine. But even if it was distributed amongst different humanitarian partners, Canadian NGOs, international NGOs, local NGOs, it will have a massive, it will make a massive difference in the life of people, and therefore protect them against the feeling that they have only one choice, which is to continue their road through all kinds of means, including irregular means and using trafficking.
So, Mr. Smith, maybe I'll ask the question in a slightly different way. If Canada was living up to its ODA goals, and if other countries were as well, because the OECD average again is less than half of what the aspirational commitment is that the UK and the Nordic countries meet or exceed. How would that have maybe even prevented these humanitarian refugee crises at all?
I'm very glad you framed the question that way. If you look at the proximate triggers and the catalysts for the 2015 migration crisis into Europe, that was because the carrying capacity, or the coverage capacity of the humanitarian aid to host states in the Middle East decreased so substantially that people had to make the choice to move. That was the catalyst. It wasn't Angela Merkel saying the doors are open. The timelines don't bear out that analysis at all. So that's the answer. I can share the numbers with you quite readily.
Because I think that's the key point. ODA is meant to prevent these crises from happening. I think because it's so underfunded, including by us. I mean, it's great that our economic growth exceeds inflation, which is maybe one of the reasons we haven't hit our campaign stated targets. But I think it's time that we do. Just so in that extent, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And in terms of the budget for your organization, again, Mr. Booz, is there an opportunity for Canada to help other countries or encourage other countries also to up their commitments? And what would be required of Canada in order to have the, I guess, the street cred in order to make our pleas to other countries more well received?
Very, very briefly.
No, and we have said that here the High Commissioner came to Canada to say that it counts on the leadership of Canada to be an example for other countries, including in terms of the level of funding dedicated to the response to refugees. So definitely that makes a difference when we can refer to Canada having increased, for example, its ODA.
We need to end this panel there. We're going to take a very, very brief break. We're going to switch panels. And just a reminder, this next session goes to just 5:15. And at 5:15, we move into a business meeting to give drafting instructions to the analysts for the report. So very briefly to switch around. Meeting back to order. To keep going, we delighted to have witnesses with us for this continuation on the study of migration challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, and continuing our discussion about the global compacts. We're going to begin with Professor Clark-Kazak. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me again here to appear before this committee. Je ferai la présentation en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français, ça me fait plaisir d'y répondre aussi en français.
I will be doing my presentation in English, but if you have questions in French, please feel free.
I'm also drawing on my experience as editor-in-chief of Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees, as well as my role as president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, IASFM. The Global Compact on Refugees, or GCR, is a compromise document, but it is likely the best the international community can do in the current political climate. It is also important to note that, while the document builds on its commitments in the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, as well as its 1967 protocol, many hosting states are not party to these conventions. Therefore, their commitment to the GCR will be important in establishing international baselines for refugee protection and rights. I would like to acknowledge Canada's strong leadership throughout the GCR process and Canadian officials' proactive, regular consultations with academics and civil society. Canada is well regarded as a key player in the multilateralism that will likely result in the adoption of the GCR in mid-December. Canada should continue to provide strong support to the GCR, however imperfect, and work to redress some of its shortcomings. I would like to recommend 5 areas in which Canada can demonstrate this leadership. First, I recommend that Canada co-organize the first Global Refugee Forum, which will be held in late 2019 or early 2020. This will be a key meeting to operationalize the GCR. While the timing is challenging given federal elections next year, I urge multi-partisan support for Canada to co-organize the Global Refugee Forum in partnership with a country which hosts large numbers of refugees. Proactive efforts need to be made to facilitate the participation of people most affected by forced migration, including refugees and host communities. One of the critiques of the GCR process was it did not engage enough with these perspectives. Canadian partnership with host states in the Global South could redress these shortcomings through the Global Refugee Forum. Second, the GCR is a political statement, not a legal document. In this absence of legal accountability mechanisms, there's a need for strong monitoring and evaluation. Unlike the Sustainable Development Goals or the United Nations Declarations on Human Rights, both of these are political documents but have actually had practical implications. There are no clear indicators in the GCR. However, the GCR references early warning, and paragraph 43 provides for the establishment of a global academic network. I have just returned from a preliminary workshop in Geneva hosted by UNHCR, and a general consensus at that meeting and the diverse IASFM membership that I represent is that this network should draw on existing research networks, many of which are led by Canadians. We need to develop GCR-specific indicators and mechanisms for data gathering. These indicators need to be sensitive to age, gender, ability, race, and many other axes of difference. Third, expand access to third country solutions is one of the 4 GCR objectives. Canada's private sponsorship example is widely cited as one way to do so. The Canadian government and colleagues at UOttawa's Refugee Hub are helping other countries to adopt and adapt sponsorship models in other contexts. This work should continue. As faculty advisor to the WUSC local committees who sponsor refugee students at both York and UOttawa, I can attest to the power of private sponsorship to change lives, both of sponsors and of refugees. I recommend that the Canadian government maintains the position of additionality, that these privately sponsored refugees are in addition to continued resettlement of government-assisted refugees. Fourth, Canada needs to strongly uphold the fundamental rights of people in situation of forced migration, including the right to claim asylum. This is one area in which the GCR falls short. Indeed, the GCR language is too often objectification of refugees. This is exemplified by example for the title Global Compact on Refugees. It's not a global compact for refugees. People in situations of forced migration are primarily viewed as burdens rather than as human resources. My textual analysis of the GCR shows that refugees are only cited as active agents in 1.6% of the references in the text. This compares with 41% where they're represented as objects and 33% as generic adjectives like refugee protection. Only one of the 4 GCR objectives is refugee-specific. It cites, quote, refugee self-reliance, unquote, rather than thinking more holistically about how refugees contribute to their host societies. Statistics Canada, for example, reports that children of immigrants, including refugees, are more likely to go to university than their Canadian-born counterparts. Many of our leaders, including the current Minister of IRCC, colleagues here in Parliament, and past Governor-Generals, came to Canada as refugees. Language matters. It has real consequences for public opinion, policymaking, and public servants' discretionary decision-making at borders and within the Immigration and Refugee Border, IRB. The right to claim asylum predates the UN Convention and the creation of Canada as a settler state. For this right to be realized, states need to allow people access to their territories to make a claim. We do not have to approve all of these claims. This is the job of the IRB, and in some cases, claims are found to be unfounded and people are sent back. But people need to be able to get here to Canada to exercise this right to claim asylum. I recommend suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement. As Ms. Kwan has already referenced here today, the U.S. is currently using tear gas against unarmed people at its borders. It has deliberately detained children away from their parents as a policy of deterrence. By any measure of safety, the U.S. is clearly not a safe third country. We need to educate average Canadians about our international legal obligations to asylum, as well as our relative place in global displacement. As I have already mentioned here in this committee, I've worked in refugee context in Uganda, a country that ranks 163rd on the Human Development Index and is tied with Pakistan as the second largest refugee hosting state in the world. Here, poor communities were receiving in one day the number of refugee claimants as Canada has received in one whole year. The Global Compact is supposed to redress these global inequities. Our internationally recognized role in the GCR process will ring hollow if we are simultaneously pursuing policies that are preventing people from exercising their right to claim asylum. Fifth and finally,
I need you to wind up quickly.
could take leadership on addressing displacement which falls outside of the global compacts, including the human caravan, which is a visible manifestation that falls between the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. Merci, je peux répondre aux questions en français.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to continue with witnesses from One Free World International. I don't know who's going to begin, Majid or Adiba.
I will start.
Okay, thank you. We have 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for inviting me. I will be speaking today about mostly the Yazidi genocide and refugee movement, especially with the 1,200 people that are arriving here to Canada with the promise of the government. One Free World International has been on the ground in Iraq and in Syria since the beginning of the genocide 5 years ago. We are having now operations as well dealing with the refugees in Ukraine and also very soon with the Rohingya. When we started the operation with the Yazidis, we found that on the ground, we found that the government unable to build the mechanism, especially dealing with the displaced, the intern displaced IDPs, because they are refugees that still in their countries, so the government couldn't have a mechanism, and yes, they try to solve this problem, but I don't think that there is a still mechanism clear. The second problem that we found that the government count a lot on the UN selections. While I'm encouraging, of course, dealing with the UN is important, but also the local NGOs on the ground that knows more the culture, the tradition, the language, I think it's very important that we found the balance between the UNHCR and between the local NGOs and the local groups. Moving from there, when the refugees arrive here, One Free World International have to step in because there was many services that was not providing to them. And I found it that it was a lot harder for the refugees, especially when you are a survivor of a sex slavery. So such as the mental health issues. There was no mental health issues was provided to the refugees. We had to build our own department with a female psychologist that speak the language in an order to be able to help the girls to heal their wounds. Let me make it clear. These girls cannot stay in Iraq anymore. We are encouraging to help the refugees and the sufferer of the persecuted within the border of their country, because I don't believe that any refugees want to leave their own home. But with regard the survivors of ISIS, because there is stigma around them in Iraq, they cannot stay in Iraq. They have to find another home for them. Now, when they came here to Canada, there was a problem with the housing. They had no credit. They had no history credit here in the country, so the housing was extremely problem. The landlords didn't want to rent the homes for them. The mental health issues, how even to go to a simple task such as grocery shopping, how to get the bus, all of this was very challenging for them. And we didn't find that there is a proper system was waiting for them upon arrival here to Canada in an order to help them to grow on the Canadian ground. My recommendation, and we will hear very soon from Adiba, and I believe that Adiba, she will share her personal story and her personal experience. I believe my recommendation that we have to build a better system, and this will be provided in the recommendation that we present it later. I'm done, thank you, and the rest of my time I would like to give it to Adiba.
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you.
My name is Adiba Yazidi. The ISIL fighters attacked the Yazidi people. My name is Adiba. I'm Yazidi. In 2014, ISIL attacked the Yazidis and killed the Yazidi people. They took the women, they raped the young women, they hid the kids, they killed our brothers, our men. They took my own family, my sisters, my brother, the family of my maternal uncle and paternal uncle. I grabbed the hands of my cousins and my brother, but until now, we don't know what has happened to them. 4 years, we know nothing about them. 3,000 Yazidi girls are captured by ISIL members, and we know nothing about them to date. They get raped, they get beaten, various forms of torture that they get subjected to. It's been for me a year and a half in this country. When I came to Canada, it was very difficult for me to get into Canada. And even here in Canada, my life has been very tough. They put us in a hotel. I don't know how to speak the language. The place is new for me. I don't know where to go. Everything has been so challenging for me. I do thank the Canadian government for bringing us here, but I have not seen any services from the Canadian government yet. No help when it comes to psychological assistance. All our requests, we ask the Canadian government to help bring our families here and to bring more Yazidis here, and to send aid to the Yazidis in the camps. It's been a year that I have been working for One Free World International. We need to bring our families here. We are making this demand we're asking this of the government, and we have heard nothing about this demand.
I would like the government to bring in more Yazidis and our parents too, and our families.
We're going to begin our questioning with Mr. Whalen, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the members of One Free World International for their very powerful testimony. In terms of the Global Compact on refugees, do you feel that the objectives of the Global Compact, and if Canada were to sign and to live up to the objectives that are set forth therein, would that be a good thing?
I believe that everything have to be done. Sorry, are you asking me or here?
Obviously you, Mr.
Oh, sorry, okay. I believe that everything have to be done in a balance. By that I mean Canada is an independent country, is an independent state. It's a good thing to sign an agreement where, you know, we have an obligation, and we do have an obligation, and we do fulfill many of these obligations internationally. However, it scares me a little bit the control or how much we are counting on the UN and how this can cause a lack of cooperation with other NGOs that can have a better understanding of the situation on the ground, plus can easier identifying the victims and how the best way to rescue them.
Ms. Clark-Kazak, I guess the same thing to you. Would you consider that the Global Compact on refugees a success, or at least a partial success, and should Canada ratify? And then in the continuation, would living up to the compact provide some additional benefit to groups that are suffering from genocide like the Yazidis?
So I just want to clarify, as the UNHCR representative has already said, this is not a document that we would ratify or not ratify. This is a UN resolution that would be adopted or not adopted by the UN General Assembly. So Canada could choose to vote against the document, but we're not actually signing on to any kind of international legal document, just to clarify that. That being said, the compact does provide for, as I mentioned, as part of a process of dealing with situations like the Yazidis and other on the ground, a resettlement option. And Canada has stepped up in relation to other populations, like, for example, the Syrians. And I think that this would be an opportunity where Canada could show leadership and could say, you know, we would be willing to resettle large numbers to Canada through the provisions of the Global Compact as a general overview.
When you say a large number, what number would you be talking about?
Well, I defer to my colleagues who are better placed to say about the particular situation, but Canada has in the past resettled large numbers of people from particular contexts. So, for example, Indo-Chinese refugees, Syrians. So I think it would be up to negotiations to see how many would need to be resettled in order for it to make an impact on the ground.
Mr. Chef, how many people would come to Canada from the displaced Yazidi population, and how many should Canada
we estimating that the numbers have to be increased to 4,000. So when it comes to when we are talking about the Yazidi situation, we are talking mostly about the victims, or I don't like to call them victims, the victors or the survivors of ISIS. So it's mostly about children and women and their families that basically they survived as ISIS and they lived. Now it's estimated that there is 7,000 of them that was kidnapped by ISIS. There is 3,200 still remain in the hand of ISIS. And we believe that at least half of this number is already being killed by airstrikes or by ISIS or by putting them as a human shield in a conflict. But I truly believe that the numbers have to increase to 4,000 in order to make an impact on the ground.
Okay, thank you. I guess moving on then to what's the title of our study, which is Opportunities and Challenges for Canada in the 21st Century, and trying to leverage the Global Compact on refugees for Canada to play a leadership role. Mr. Clark, Ms. Clark-Kazan, when you talked about the development of metrics and the global academic network, is there an opportunity for Canada to play a leadership role there?
Yes, definitely. I think that the global compact, the problem with it is that it's this consensus document where there's actually very little detail. So there's no funding for the global academic network. There's no secretariat set up. So this is an area where Canada could offer leadership, especially given the fact that Canadian academics, for better or for worse, do lead a lot of the international associations on this issue. And I think that what we need in terms of thinking about the scholarly or research side is trying to make sure that we are able to identify those needs, as was just witnessed here, and then be able to bring those to the international community so that there can be a solution to very pressing needs.
Now, you did talk about co-hosting a forum, or the expected forum under the Global Compact. And I don't understand all the politics and the procedure of the UN, so you'll have to maybe educate us a little bit here. If there was going to be a secretariat or some data collection agency associated with it, would this be done individually by the member states, and then they would share that information through the UN, or would such a secretariat or data collection function be funded within the United Nations by the member states?
Right. So currently, the way that it's being conceived of is an independent secretariat. UNHCR would host that secretariat until someone else sort of stepped up to take it over. It's supposed to be independent from the member states because there's supposed to be some kind of element of oversight. So there needs to be some independence or separation from the member states. At the moment, there is no funding allocated for it. So there would need to be a donor who would step up to do that.
And I'm not sure if you would have this information. We would have to request it from the UN. But in your experience, what is the normal budget for a UN secretariat?
I don't know.
Maybe that's something the clerks can get with us. I have a couple more questions, but I think I'm getting. Okay, so in terms of the hosting of this forum. And, you know, there's the 23 different objectives set out in the Global Compact on migration, and the refugees has their own. Is this meant to be a forum restricted solely to the Global Compact on refugees, or is it meant to address both the Migration Compact as well as the Refugee Compact?
So the forum itself is on the Global Compact on refugees only.
And I would also just like to reiterate a statement that you said earlier about the way that these documents are drafted. Certainly, and in fact, I think at one point you may have referred to refugees as human resources, and I think I would maybe like to also just refer to them as human beings. And we're just trying to help human beings, and we shouldn't be trying to divide them up as assets or burdens. And so I think remembering that little bit of compassion, as you reminded us earlier, I think is helpful for our letter to the minister that will come out of this study.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. Mr. Maguire for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do have some questions. But first, I'd like to use a couple of minutes of my time just to provide notice of a couple of motions. The first one would be that the Standing Committee on Immigration and Citizenship invite the Parliamentary Budget Officer for a 2-hour meeting to discuss his report titled Costing Irregular Migration Across Canada's Southern Border before the House rises before Christmas. And the second one would be that the Committee of Immigration and Citizenship formally request the Auditor General undertake a fulsome review of the irregular migrants crossing the southern border. That audit would include IRCC, IRB, RCMP, CBSA, CSIS, CSIS, and the functioning of the ad hoc intergovernmental task force on irregular migration. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today as well. We've got a bit of a dilemma, I think, in regards to the safe third country agreements define a family member as including sisters and brothers, grandfathers and grandmothers, grandchildren, uncles and aunts, etc. And that means that someone who crosses the border illegally can have as many extended family members as they want cross into Canada legally at a port of entry. On the other hand, when we've got the 1-year window of opportunities provisions that allows resettled refugees to sponsor family members to Canada, defines a family member only as spouses and children. We know that this has been difficult for Yazidis in Canada because many of the women have, as indicated, lost their husbands and wish or other male members of the family and wish they could sponsor other male relatives. Do you think it's fair that illegal border crossers are allowed to bring extended family members into the country when Yazidi refugees are not allowed to do so? If I could have your comments, please, Michelle.
Do you want to ask her or do you want to ask me?
I'll ask you, and she can respond to if she likes. Adiba would be great as well.
أنت فهمت السؤال? Did you understand the question?
لا أنا ما فهمت
أنت ما فهمتيش السؤال؟
لا ما فهمت كويس.
I believe when it comes to the victims of genocide, any genocide, we have to make it clear that there is exception here, because when we're talking about genocide, we're talking about a whole generation, a whole family being killed. One of the major effects that we see on the victims or the survivors of the genocide is how they are being divided from their family. And I think we have to have an exception for them, in a sense of not just for them, any of the survivor of genocide. We have to have an exception for them in order to make them feel united again, to make them feel that they are whole again. The problem that we think that the genocide is over. It was 4 years ago or 5 years ago and it was over. In reality, the genocide is still going. And there is still people still kidnapped, there is still people still missing, we don't know any news. So in a short answer, I believe that extending permissions or make an exception for them is very proper.
Thank you. I would also, I note, as we have with others, that there was a shortfall in regards to the mental health provided, the translation provided as well. We needed housing, no credit, these kinds of things were difficult. And we've heard from witnesses in regards to ideas on how to deal with these, to try and make them more accessible, I guess, for these services that are required when they first get here. You talked about building a better system. What would some of your suggestions be in that? What do you suppose the government should do to be able to be more helpful in that area?
I think when it comes to the mental health issues, we all talking about mental health issues. One of the things is building bridges with the community upon their arrival. For example, Adiba, a year ago, had a meltdown situation where she was watching something in the internet and she have completely meltdown. We had to take her to Mackenzie Hospital. In Mackenzie Hospital, I was in prison. I was in another area and I came as quickly as possible as I can. By the time I did that, the Mackenzie Hospital decided to tie her hands and her legs to the bed. That's exactly what ISIS used to do before they assault her. So, and we have a video of that. So we took a video, we took an evidence of what's happened. I believe that first of all, we have to educate our workers, like what they're going through. These are not crazy people running around. These are people that they are victims, they're survivors, they're victors. I believe that's how I like to call them. And they have a special need in order to deal with this. So I believe education, our team before they arrive about the situation. I believe it's very important that we build bridges with these communities. So we have institutions, like many times when we went to speak with some certain members in the government about the mental health issues, they said, well, you have institutions out there. You can just go and knock on their door. There is none of the victims of sex slavery will go knock on their door. This will not happen because they are hurt. Plus, there is a stigma about mental health issue within their country as well. So they believe if you went to psychologists, you are, like people in your community will not speak very kindly of you. So you have to build bridges. You have to go and knock on their door, sit down with them, explain to them how important that is in order to move forward in your life. So I would say building better bridges and communication with the community. I would say educating our workers before they deal with them is extremely important.
Thank you. It seems like we're a compassionate country, as Adiba had pointed out. But one of the things I take from your comments is that we need to do a much better job of knowing who's coming, when they're arriving, and how to greet them when they first get here so that they are actually can follow a path and be understood better as they arrive. Would that be the case?
Yes, with one just simple correction. We are a very compassionate country. We are. I will never forget
providing the services.
Let me explain why I said that. Because I saw how the community, so I am one of the people that I believe that the government should not do everything on their own. The community have to help, takes a village. So I saw the bus driver that took them without taking the fare from them, or I took them to the supermarket and refused to, to take money from them to honor them.
I need you to draw to a close, please.
I saw how the Canadian people is, generous and kind. We have gaps in the system that have to be covered in order to make it a better system.
Thank you. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I thank all the witnesses, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge and say thank you to you, Adiba, for coming forward as a witness. It's extremely difficult and I think courageous for you to come and share your story with us and to be that advocate and voice for change. So I want to acknowledge that. As we're talking about the Global Compact, one of the issues with the Global Compact is that it does not include internally displaced, which are the Yazidis community. And so therefore there's a flaw, if you will, within the Global Compact. From the internally displaced communities, from the Yazidis community point of view, one of the issues that you've raised is that you would like to see Canada bring more Yazidis to the country, and part of that is with respect to family reunification. So would you agree then that the government should allow for the one-year window of opportunity initiative to not have a deadline? So in the event that you find out that you have a survivor family member out there, that family would be able to come without through the one-year window of opportunity stream.
هاي بهالسنة نحن نطلب من الحكومة نحن
Sorry, we've been here for 1 year. I've asked the government to bring in my family to Canada. And my families are still in refugee camps. They want to come here. Yazidis in camps have no life. They are not living properly. I would like to call on the government of Canada to bring in our families. I've been here for 1.5 years, and that's my plea to the government. Unfortunately, I never heard back from the government.
So these family members, are they your, how are they related to you? Can you tell our committee that? Are they your aunts, your cousins, your sisters?
My father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, uncle, paternal and maternal uncles, all Yazidis are like my family. You are here, you can't imagine how Yazidis are living in refugee camps. I came right from a refugee camp. I do know what they're experiencing very well. I'm sure that they know that they don't have a future and their future is grim.
Definition of what is deemed to be family. And in that instance, nuclear families is how we defined it. But of course, for your community and many other communities as well, the family unit is far beyond, it's the extended family. And I think in your context, you are also referring to your Yazidis brothers and sisters in the broader community because your community faced a genocide. And so I think what I'm hearing from you is that you're calling for the government to change the family reunification definition of what's family and to expand that to include the extended family. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yes, what I want from the Canadian government is that they receive all the Yazidis, especially in refugee camps. If they can bring in Yazidis as much as they can, or if they can deliver aid to them in the refugee camps. However, more importantly, I want them to increase, I want the Canadian government to increase the numbers, not only 1,200 families, that's very little. That's a very little number compared to the number of the Yazidis being perpetrated.
refer to 4,000 Yazidis for the Canadian government to, and so I assume, can I assume that is the number that, Adiba, you're also referring to 4,000 for the government to resettle?
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to ask Ms. Clark-Kazak, I wonder whether or not that is something that you would support. Given, I know earlier you couldn't give a number, but now we've heard from people from the community, from the Yazidis community, who are advocating for that number. Is that something that you would support as well?
I would support the resettlement of as many Yazidis as necessary to resolve that long-standing and entrenchable issue. I think this is where Canada has shown leadership in the past, and this is where Canada can show leadership now.
Okay. And on the question around having family members here and also other Yazidis members here, the importance of that. I note that, the trauma as a survivor is significant. And to have people from your community here, to have your extended family members here, how important is that to your healing process and to your recovery through that trauma? So my question is to Adiba.
Well, the need is to help the girls who are here by bringing their families from Iraq. We don't have any psychological services offered by the government. We've seen this from One Free World International, but not from the government, just from that organization that gives doctors and psychologists these kinds of helps. We are in a new country. We have the language barrier. We don't know nothing about the new country. So if it weren't for the One Free World International supporting the Yazidis, it would have been so difficult for Yazidis.
Together, it is an important step for healing the wounds of the genocide, yes.
One of the issues, Adiba, I know the trauma is significant, and Mrs. Shafi, you mentioned that she had, quote-unquote, a meltdown. I believe that it was a convulsion disorder that she had suffered, and I believe that other survivors suffer that as well. Doctors have indicated that one path forward to assist them is to bring their family members here, to be around loved ones and other Yazidi families for support emotionally as well. And so to that end, I wonder whether or not...
I'm afraid I need to end you there. That's at your time. Mr. Ayoub, we have 2 minutes for you. Sorry.
Ah oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I thought I wouldn't have any time, so I'm a bit surprised, but nonetheless, I am very touched by the testimony given by Adiba. Unfortunately, in 2 minutes, I do not have the time to ask in-depth questions. I would like to talk about the Global Compact, the fear of the unknown of foreigners, people like Adiba who are coming from these kinds of situations. Does that explain why some countries have withdrawn? Does this explain why there is this confrontation that we see where people feel they are endangered, the citizens feel endangered? Does that explain why some countries have withdrawn? I think, like Mr. Smith said in the other session, was that this is an internal political issue. The citizens of those countries are afraid of foreigners, and they push local politicians not to accept immigrants. Do you think that we have that kind of political rhetoric here in Canada? I think that we can look at what has happened in Quebec and in Ontario recently, and we can be afraid of what could be happening at the federal level.
Thank you. We need to bring to a close this part of the meeting. I'm going to do 2 things, though. I would like to request that the clerk forward to the One Free World International. I think you have this, but I want to make sure you have the report that was done by our committee in March 2018, as well as the government response tabled to the House of Commons on August 22nd, and the debate in the House of Commons on November 28th. I think I just want to make sure your organization has those documents, because I think that some of our discussion here related to some of those documents.
I will appreciate that. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, so
Chair.
we will make sure those are forwarded by the clerk. The second thing, thank you both for your testimony. I'm going to suggest that the bulk of the testimony from One Free World be included in our migration study report, because it was really on our migration, and that we include that in, but it was not really part of our Global Compact report.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, on that point, I think it should be noted, though, that Global Compact does not include internally displaced, and that is a flaw within that, and that is also an explicit purpose of why these witnesses have been invited here, to point out that is part of the flaw. So I don't think that it should be excluded, Mr. Chair. Perhaps it could be included in both, if you like, but that is one flaw to which the Global Compact exists.
A perceived flaw, I understand that. Thank you very much. We're going to close this part of the meeting now and move to the business meeting, which is in camera.